The air in the old gymnasium hung thick and heavy, a familiar soup of sweat, chalk dust, and the dull rubber scent from the worn-out mats. It was a smell that spoke of countless hours of hard work, of dropped weights, of strained muscles, and of dreams both made and broken. For most of the people there, it was the smell of home. For her, it was the smell of a challenge. She sat on a simple wooden bench, away from the main hustle, her back against the cool concrete wall. A crisp white felt like a second skin, its fabric rough against her fingertips as she rubbed her palms together. A small, nervous habit she could never quite shake dot around her. The scene was a controlled chaos. Large men, their bodies taped and braced, moved with a heavy confidence. They shadow-boxed, they grappled, they shouted words of encouragement or friendly insults across the vast space. Their laughter was loud and boisterous, echoing off the high ceiling. It was a world built on power and presence, a world where size was often mistaken for strength. She, in contrast, was a quiet island in that ocean of noise. Her frame was slight, her muscles lean rather than bulky. Her dark hair was pulled back into a simple, tight braid that fell between her shoulder blades. She didn't shout or posture. She just breathed, focusing on the rhythm of her own inhale and exhale, trying to find a pocket of calm in the storm. Then, a voice crackled over the old speaker system, cutting through the noise with a static hiss. Next match, Mat 3, Anya Petrova versus Viktor the Bear Volkov. A hush seemed to fall over the section of the gym nearest to her, followed immediately by a new wave of whispers. Heads turned. Eyes, wide with curiosity or narrowed with skepticism, found her on the bench. She could feel their gazes like a physical weight, pinning her down. She heard the snippets of conversation, the unfiltered judgments that floated through the air. Is that her? She's a bit small, isn't she? This is going to be over in 10 seconds. Poor girl, what was she thinking signing up for this? A man, a coach with a face carved from years of frowning, shook his head slowly as he looked at her, then turned to his student and muttered something she couldn't hear but understood perfectly. It was a look of pity, of disappointment in a match that wasn't even worthy of the scoreboard. She felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach, but she pushed it down. She had been here before in this exact situation in different gyms and different tournaments. The story was always the same. They saw her size, her quiet demeanor, and they wrote her off before she had even taken a step onto the mat. She stood up, smoothing down the front of her jai. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried. She didn't look at anyone, didn't give the whispers the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she began her walk towards the designated mat. Each step felt like a mile. The floor seemed to tilt under the weight of 100 stairs. She could hear the soft scuff of her own feet on the concrete, a sound that was completely drowned out by the growing murmur of the crowd. They were building a narrative in their heads, a story of a brutal mismatch, a spectacle of a giant swatting a fly. On the other side of the mat, her opponent was making his own entrance. Viktor didn't walk. He lumbered. He was a mountain of a man with a thick, dark beard and a chest that strained against the fabric of his own GI. His arms were like tree trunks, covered in a colorful tapestry of old tattoos. He moved with an easy, rolling confidence, the gait of a predator who had never known fear. As he stepped onto the mat, he barely glanced in her direction. He just turned to his corner, a broad, dismissive smile spreading across his face as he shared a laugh with his coach. It was a look that said it all. This wasn't a competition. It was an inconvenience, a brief, boring formality before his real match later in the day. She reached the edge of the mat and paused. The referee, a man with a kind face but tired eyes, gave her a small, sympathetic smile. "Just do your best, kid," he said, his voice gentle. The words were meant to be encouraging, but they landed like another judgment, another confirmation that no one expected her to actually win. She just nodded, unable to find her voice. She stepped onto the mat. The surface was firm beneath her bare feet, a familiar grounding sensation. She walked to her designated starting mark, her eyes fixed on the plain, red circle in the center of the mat. She blocked out the faces in the crowd, the whispers, the pitying looks. She blocked out the hulking form of her opponent as he took his place opposite her. The world shrank until it was just her, the mat, and the sound of her own heart beating a steady, determined rhythm in her chest. The referee raised his hand, ready to start the match. The judgment was over. The moment was about to begin. The referee's hand sliced through the air, a sharp, clean motion that signaled the start. The word "begin" hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the world exploded into motion. Victor, the bear, didn't need any more invitation. He moved like a boulder rolling downhill, all momentum and raw power. His plan was written in every tensed muscle: end this, end it now, and get back to waiting for a real challenge. He lunged forward, his arms outstretched like the claws of a grizzly, aiming to grab her jai, get a grip, and use his superior weight to fling her onto the mat with one spectacular slam. From her side, everything went quiet. The roar of the crowd, the squeak of shoes on the polished floor beyond the mat, even the frantic beating of her own heart, it all faded into a dull, distant hum. Her world narrowed to a single point of focus, the man rushing towards her. She didn't see a monster. She saw a sequence of events. She saw the way his left foot planted a fraction of a second before his right, the slight drop of his right shoulder, the way his eyes locked onto her chest, not her eyes. These were clues? They were tells. As his hands, big enough to encircle her waist, reached for her, she didn't step back. She didn't try to brace herself. Instead, she moved to the side, a single, fluid step that was impossibly small yet just enough. It was less like a dodge and more like she was a ghost, letting his solid form pass right through the space she had just occupied. She could feel the air stir as his arm whipped past her face, a warm breeze generated by his sheer force. There was a soft thump as his foot landed heavily on the mat where she had been standing, his own momentum carrying him a step too far. A small, collective ooh rippled through the spectators. It was the sound of surprise, the brief acknowledgement that something unexpected had just happened. But it was quickly replaced by a murmur of dismissal. "Lucky," someone muttered. "He just missed." Victor grunted, a sound of pure annoyance. He turned, his face already flushing a deeper shade of red. He had expected to feel the satisfying thud of her body on the mat, to hear the gasp of the air being knocked out of her. Instead, he felt nothing but empty air and a prickle of embarrassment. He saw her standing there, calm as ever, her feet planted, her expression unreadable. She hadn't even flinched. This time, his anger began to simmer. He wouldn't underestimate her again. He wouldn't lunge. He would stalk. He began to circle her, his movements heavy and deliberate, like a shark circling a small fish. The crowd watched, their interest piqued again. Anya mirrored his movements, her feet gliding silently over the mat. Her body always turned slightly towards him, presenting the smallest possible target. She was a study in stillness, while he was a portrait of barely contained aggression. He feinted left, then right, trying to get a reaction, trying to make her commit to a move. She didn't fall for it. Her eyes were soft, almost unfocused, as if she were looking through him rather than at him. The frustration was becoming a tangible thing. He couldn't stand it anymore. With a roar that was more anger than effort, he charged again. This time it wasn't a single lunge, but a series of powerful shoves, each one designed to drive her backward, to force her out of the safety of the mat and into defeat. He was like a human battering ram, and the crowd leaned forward, sensing the end. They saw a small, scared girl being backed into a corner by an unstoppable force. They saw her feet scrambling, her body retreating. They saw fear, but that's not what Anya felt. Inside her calm exterior, her mind was working at lightning speed. With each shove, she was learning. She felt the exact pressure of his hands against her arms, the way his weight shifted forward just before he pushed. She wasn't just being pushed. She was absorbing information. Each time he made contact, she didn't resist it. She would yield to the pressure, taking a step back to dissipate the force, her arms moving in small, soft circles to deflect his hands away before he could get a solid grip. It was like trying to push water. His hands would sink in, but the water would simply flow away, leaving him pushing at nothing. To the untrained eye, it looked pathetic. It looked like she was on the verge of tears, desperately trying to stay away from him. A woman in the front row even covered her eyes, unable to watch the inevitable, brutal conclusion. Victor's coach was shouting now, "That's it! Keep the pressure on. She's scared. She's got nothing." Victor believed it. He saw her retreating form and felt a surge of triumphant cruelty. He had her. He was driving her across the mat, step by painful step. His confidence swelled, ballooning into pure arrogance. He was no longer just fighting. He was putting on a show. He was the predator, and this little mouse was finally cornered. He pushed her one last time, with all his might, aiming to pin her against the edge of the mat. And in that moment, as she took the final step back, her heel just a hair's breadth from the red line, she did something strange. As he stumbled forward from the force of his own push, overextending as he had done before, she lifted her hand and, with the lightest possible touch, gently tapped him on the center of his back. It was so small, so quick that almost no one saw it. It wasn't a strike. It wasn't a push. It was a tap. A message. It said, "I was here. And you didn't even know it." Victor felt it. A tiny, insignificant pressure on his back like a fly landing. He stumbled, caught his balance, and whipped around, his face a mask of pure rage. He was cornered, he was tired, and he had just been made a fool of, even if no one else seemed to notice. He saw her standing there, right on the edge, no longer looking calm, but looking ready. He had misjudged her completely. But his pride wouldn't let him believe it. He saw her position, trapped against the line, and his rage twisted back into confidence. He thought she had made a final, fatal mistake. He roared and wound up for one last, massive, fight-ending charge, completely oblivious to the fact that he was walking right into the trap she had so patiently set. The tap on his back was the final spark. It wasn't the touch itself, but what it represented. It was a whisper of mockery, a sign that he was being played with. For a man like Victor, who built his entire identity on being an immovable, unstoppable force, this was the ultimate insult. The red haze of anger that had been simmering in his vision now boiled over, completely clouding his judgment. All thought of strategy, of technique, of patience, evaporated like water on a hot skillet. There was only one thought left, roaring in his ears like a freight train. Finish her. He saw her standing there, right on the edge of the mat, her back to the out-of-bounds line. In his mind, she was a cornered animal, and this was her final, desperate stand. He didn't register the calmness in her posture, the way her weight was perfectly balanced. He only saw the target. He took a deep, ragged breath, the air whistling through his nostrils. His muscles, already coiled and tight, bunched up with terrifying power. He was going to put everything he had into this one last, monumental effort. He wasn't just trying to win anymore. He was trying to erase the last few minutes from existence to prove to everyone, and especially to himself, that he was still the king of this mat. From her side of the mat, the world had slowed down to a crawl. The roaring in Victor's ears was a distant storm to her. She could see the rage in his eyes, the way his body was tensing for the explosion. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment she had been guiding him towards with every retreat, every deflection, every subtle movement. He was no longer thinking. He was pure, unadulterated reaction. And that's when she made her move. It was so subtle that almost no one would have noticed. She shifted her weight onto her back foot, the one planted firmly just inches from the line. At the same time, she let her front shoulder dip just a fraction of an inch. Her guard, which had been an impenetrable wall of calm deflection, suddenly looked like it was drooping. Her eyes, which had been soft and focused, widened for a split second, a flicker of something that could easily be mistaken for panic, for the realization that she was finally trapped. It was a performance, a masterpiece of physical acting, and it was designed for an audience of one. Victor saw it all. He saw the dip of the shoulder, the falter in her guard, the look of fear in her eyes. To him, it was a confession. She was tired. She was scared. She had made a mistake. A triumphant, predatory grin spread across his face. This was it. This was the opening he had been dreaming of. His brain screamed at him to take it, to lunge forward and grab that exposed shoulder, to use all his strength to drive her backward and off the mat in a final humiliating display of dominance. He launched himself forward. It wasn't a charge. It was an explosion. He pushed off the mat with such force that his foot left a faint scuff mark. His body was a missile, locked onto its target. His arms were outstretched, his hands ready to clamp down on her like a steel trap. The crowd, seeing the same thing he saw, let out a collective gasp. They rose to their feet, a wave of bodies moving as one, their faces a mixture of excitement and pity. They knew this was the end. They could see the mistake as clearly as he could. They were all judging her again, but this time not as weak, but as foolish for making such a basic error at the worst possible moment, but as Victor's massive frame surged forward, covering the distance between them in a heartbeat. Anya's mistake transformed into something else entirely. The dip of her shoulder became the beginning of a perfect, fluid pivot. The falter in her guard became the opening she needed to slip her arm inside his reaching grasp. The look of fear in her eyes was replaced by a laser-like focus, a cold fire of absolute concentration. The panic they had all seen was a lie. The truth was in her feet, her back foot, which had seemed to be on the verge of stepping out of bounds, anchored itself to the mat. It didn't just stop. It rooted, as if it had grown deep, invisible tendrils into the floor. Her entire body, which had seemed to be off balance and retreating, suddenly became a perfect, immovable center of gravity. She was no longer retreating. She was the eye of the hurricane, the calm, silent center around which all the chaos was about to violently swirl. Victor was too far gone to see the change. He was committed. He had put all his faith, all his power, all his momentum into one single, brutal action. His hands were almost upon her, his body twisting into the throw that he believed would end the match. He could already feel the sweet satisfaction of victory. He was so close he could smell the faint scent of her shampoo, a clean, simple scent that was completely out of place in the sweaty, dusty gym. He was a predator who had just sunk his teeth into his prey, completely unaware that he was the one who had walked into the trap. He was a falling boulder, moments away from hitting the ground, not realizing the ground was about to move. The world became a blur of motion and intent. Victor's massive hands, rough and calloused from years of gripping and pulling, finally made contact with her jai. For him, it was a moment of pure, victorious certainty. He felt the rough fabric under his fingers and his mind screamed, "Got her." He could feel the heat radiating from her body, a small, fragile warmth against his own raging furnace. He was already tightening his grip, his muscles screaming as he began to twist his torso and hips, pouring every ounce of his being into the throw that would end this farce. He was so close, so utterly convinced of his victory, that he didn't notice the one thing that mattered most. He was exactly where she wanted him to be, for her. The world was a series of perfect, interconnected geometries. His hands grabbing her was not an attack. It was an invitation. It was the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. She didn't fight his grip. She welcomed it. As his powerful body twisted, her own body began its own counter-movement, but it was different. It wasn't born of rage or power. It was born of precision, of thousands of hours of practice, of a deep, intuitive understanding of balance and leverage. The moment his weight shifted forward, her world shifted with it. Time seemed to stretch and warp, the frantic seconds elongating into an eternity of breathtaking detail. Her hip, which had been a part of a retreating motion, suddenly dropped. It didn't just move down. It seemed to sink into the mat, becoming a fixed point in the universe, an immovable object against which an unstoppable force was about to break itself. It was a perfect, seamless pivot, a motion so fluid and natural it looked less like a technique and more like a law of physics being demonstrated. Her arm, which had seemed to be trapped in his grasp, was no longer passive. It moved with a will of its own, sliding inside his elbow, hooking it with a delicate but unbreakable lock. It wasn't a feat of strength. It was a placement, a key turning in a lock. She was connecting her body to his, creating a single, unified system where she was the operator and he was the machine. Victor's triumphant roar caught in his throat. In that microsecond, his brain registered that something was terribly wrong. The momentum he had been generating, the powerful forward thrust that was supposed to send her flying, was being redirected. It was like trying to push a river upstream. He felt a sickening lurch in his stomach as his own power was turned against him. His feet, which had been so firmly planted, suddenly felt light, then weightless. The look of triumph on his face melted away, replaced by a wide-eyed, slack-jawed confusion. He was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted, and the trap had been sprung. The crowd, which had been on its feet, a roaring beast anticipating a violent climax, fell silent. It was a collective, audible gasp, a sharp intake of breath from 100 lungs at once. They saw it, but they couldn't process it. Where they expected to see her small body being lifted and thrown, they saw the impossible. They saw Victor, the bear, the unmovable object, leave the ground. His body, a mountain of muscle and bone, was lifted into the air as if he weighed nothing. He was completely appended, his legs kicking uselessly at the ceiling, his face a mask of utter disbelief. Then came the sound. It wasn't a dull thud. It was a thunderous, percussive crack that echoed through the silent gymnasium like a gunshot. It was the sound of 200 pounds of solid man hitting the mat with all the force of his own momentum, amplified by her perfect technique. The vibration traveled through the floor, up the legs of the spectators, a physical shockwave that announced the arrival of a new reality. The sound of the air being violently forced from his lungs was a soft, pathetic whoosh that followed the impact. And then there was silence. A profound, deafening silence that was heavier and more impactful than the noise that had come before. It was the silence of a shared collective amazement. No one spoke. No one moved. They just stared. The woman in the front row, who had covered her eyes, now had her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Victor's coach stood frozen, his mouth still open from the shout he had been about to give. His face a blank canvas of shock. On the mat, Victor lay on his back, staring up at the harsh fluorescent lights of the gymnasium. His mind was a blank slate. The world was spinning, and a dull, throbbing pain was beginning to spread through his back and shoulders, but it was nothing compared to the psychic shock. He tried to piece together what had happened. 1 second, he was on the verge of victory, a god of power and destruction. The next, he was on the floor, looking up at the world, the air knocked out of him, his pride shattered into a million pieces. He had been defeated not by a stronger opponent, but by something he couldn't even comprehend. It was like he had been defeated by a ghost, by a principle, by an idea. She stood over him, not in a pose of dominance or triumph, but in a simple, relaxed stance. Her breathing was calm and even, as if she had just done nothing more strenuous than a morning stretch. There was no smirk on her face, no gloating in her eyes. There was only a quiet, centered stillness. She looked down at him, not with pity or arrogance, but with a simple, neutral acknowledgement. She hadn't beaten a man. She had solved a problem, and the solution had been elegant, efficient, and utterly devastating. The referee, who had seen thousands of matches in his career, stood frozen for a full 3 seconds, his whistle hanging forgotten around his neck. His eyes darted from the girl standing calmly to the giant lying dazed on the mat. He was a judge, and in that moment he was forced to judge not just the match, but everything he thought he knew about strength, about power, about the very nature of a fight. The judgment had been made before she played. But now, seconds later, the only judgment left in the room was one of pure, unadulterated amazement. The silence in the gymnasium was a living thing. It was heavy, thick, and pressing, so much more powerful than the roar that had filled the room just moments before. It was the silence of a shared, collective holding of breath. On the mat, Victor lay sprawled on his back, his massive frame looking strangely small and broken. The harsh fluorescent lights of the gym blurred into a single, blinding star in his vision. His mind was a scrambled mess, trying to rewind the last few seconds, to find the point where the world had turned upside down. He could feel a dull, throbbing ache spreading through his back and shoulders, a deep, bone-deep pain that was a physical echo of his shattered pride. He had been defeated. Not just beaten, but dismantled, taken apart piece by a force he couldn't understand. It wasn't a loss. It was an unraveling. He blinked slowly, the world coming back into focus. He saw her standing over him, not towering, but simply present. Her face was calm, her breathing even. There was no triumph in her eyes, no gloating smile on her lips. She was just there, a quiet, undeniable fact. In that moment, looking up at her, Victor felt something new. It wasn't anger or even frustration. It was a strange, grudging respect. He had been a predator his whole life, using his size and strength to intimidate and dominate. He had never once considered that there was a different kind of power, a power that didn't come from bulk, but from balance, from precision, from a deep and quiet understanding of how the world works. He had been a hammer, and she had been a surgeon. The referee finally seemed to snap out of his trance. He took a hesitant step onto the mat, his eyes wide as he looked from the dazed giant to the calm girl. He had seen thousands of throws, thousands of matches, but he had never seen anything like that. It was less a throw and more a correction, a physical proof of a scientific principle. He opened his mouth to say something, to start the count, but then he stopped. He looked at Victor, saw the fight gone from his eyes, saw the dawning understanding on his face. There was no need for a count. The match was over. Victor knew it too. He couldn't move, not because he was physically unable, but because the fight had completely drained out of him. He took a ragged breath, the air filling his lungs with a painful sting. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his right hand from the mat and held it up, a signal of surrender. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like the heaviest thing he had ever lifted. It was an admission, an acknowledgement that he had been beaten not by a stronger man, but by a better artist. The moment his hand went up, the spell was broken. A single person in the crowd started to clap. It was a solitary, sharp sound that cut through the thick silence. Then another person joined in. And another. Within seconds, the single claps had merged into a growing wave of applause. It wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping for a good match. It was different. It was loud, it was enthusiastic, and it was filled with a raw, unfiltered sense of awe. People were on their feet again, but this time they weren't leaning forward in anticipation of a spectacle. They were standing in tribute to a miracle. The whispers of judgment had been replaced by shouts of amazement. Did you see that? How did she do that? Incredible. She stood there for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. Then she did something that no one expected. She took a step forward and knelt down beside Victor. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him, her expression soft. Then she extended her hand, a simple, open-palmed offer of help. Victor looked at her small, delicate hand, then back at her face. He saw no pity there, only respect. He hesitated for a second, then reached up and took her hand. Her grip was surprisingly firm. With her help, he began the slow, difficult process of getting his 250-pound frame off the mat. He felt like a child being helped up by his mother. It was humbling, but it was also strangely cleansing. Once he was on his feet, swaying slightly, she let go of his hand and gave a small, respectful bow. He returned it, a clumsy, uncertain bow from a man who was learning a new language. The referee stepped forward, his face now beaming with a huge, genuine smile. He took her wrist and, with a clear, proud voice that boomed through the now cheering gymnasium, he raised her arm into the air. "Winner!" He shouted, but the word was almost lost in the deafening roar of the crowd. She didn't pump her fist or shout in victory. She just stood there, her arm held high, her other hand resting calmly at her side. She looked out at the sea of faces, but she wasn't really seeing them. She was feeling the moment. She was feeling the vibration of the applause through the solace of her feet. She was feeling the cool air on her skin. She was feeling the quiet, steady beat of her own heart. This was why she did it. Not for the glory, not for the victory, but for these rare, perfect moments where everything came together, where mind and body and spirit moved as one. It was a feeling of pure, unadulterated peace. After a few moments, she gently pulled her arm from the referee's grasp and gave him a nod of thanks. Then she turned and began to walk off the mat. The crowd parted for her like the sea. People reached out, not to touch her, but just to be closer to the energy that surrounded her. The whispers that followed her now were completely different. They were filled with wonder, with respect, with a newfound understanding. They no longer saw a small girl in a man's world. They saw a master. They had judged her before she played, but now they would never forget what they had seen. She had not just won a match. She had changed their perception of what was possible. She picked up her water bottle from the bench where she had left it, took a long, slow drink, and without a backward glance, she walked out of the gymnasium and into the quiet of the evening, leaving behind a room full of people who would be telling this story for a very long time.